Hey everyone, welcome to the Swift Kick Show. It is time to kick it in gear. My name is Kevin Griffin, and I'm joined today by Steve Albers. How are you, Steve?
We're good. I'm good, thank you. How are you doing?
Doing well, doing well. So I'm playing around with the format a little. Not too much at all. But let's jump right into some notes. So I have a little presentation here. So again, welcome everyone out there. I see folks coming into the room. As you're coming in, leave a note in the chat. Tell us where you're from. Are you here in the US? Are you overseas? Let's get that conversation going early because yeah, it's so hard to be the first one to type in the chat. So just, be that person. Type something. Or nothing at all. I mean, people are just sitting there. All right, we'll give them a minute. My name, as I said, is Kevin Griffin. I own SwiftKick. We are a training and consulting company based out of Southeast Virginia. And the SwiftKick show is designed to just give you all tons of value from really smart people like Steve over here. And we have a great lineup over the next couple of weeks. And of course, I don't know what any of the topics are, but I know they're really good people. So they're guaranteed to be entertaining and informational. Michael Silverman, I met him on Coder Cruise a couple of weeks ago, where we were on a cruise ship in the middle of the Caribbean. And we were talking about technology and doing all this really cool stuff. So I'm looking forward to that. Mr. Sidney Andrews, our resident Azure expert, is going to come back and talk about something Azure. Not sure what, of course, but we'll figure it out. With Ignite being just this past week, there's probably a lot of really new stuff that we need to talk about. Miss Jenna Carlton, she submitted her talk idea to us today, and it's about how being a pro wrestler taught her to learn more, love more about testing. And I've seen parts of this talk before, and it's guaranteed to be a good time. And then Aisha Blake, she just agreed to come on to the show not too long ago. I'm not sure where or what she's going to talk about, but again, guaranteed to be a good time. And, we have a really one date in between that's free. But if you're interested in being on the SwiftKick show, we would love to have you. Just drop me a line on Twitter or, go to our website. All of our contact information is there. But let's get into the meat of it. Mr. Steve Albers, before we start with your awesome topic, I think you've had more Twitter social love than some of our previous guests have in a while, just because it's a really good topic for anyone out there who's a web developer and trying to make some of these critical decisions. But before we get started, let's talk about you, Steve. Are you interested in talking about yourself for a minute?
I'm scared, but go ahead.
All right. Well, let's start here. With every guest, I always like to know your origin story. So if no one's ever met you before, we assume you didn't just drop into being a really smart guy. You probably had to build up to it. So take us all the way back to the beginning and tell us how you got into software development and how did you get to where you are today?
Wow, good question, and thank you. And by the way, when you're talking about the show and the upcoming speakers, I wanted to say really quick, I've spent some time over the last month going through a lot of the previous speakers that you had on YouTube, and they were really fantastic talks by some talking about smart people. And so if people haven't checked that out, I was going to recommend that. Great stuff there, and some things that fit back into the talk I'm doing today from some of the folks. But I guess I would say I got started when my dad did computer work on mainframes for the government, and he had bought an Apple II Plus when I was a kid, and did a little bit of basic programming on that to start with, based on watching how government mainframe computer work was set up. I decided there was no way I ever wanted to do that. I never wanted to be a punch card jockey. And so I kind of stepped away from it, went off and got a business degree and started in a different path. But what happened is after I got out of school, I saw that some of my friends that had been involved in this really had these great business opportunities, had these fantastic jobs, and it was this great market. So I had gone off and played in a band for a living for a year. It was what I did. And when I got out of that, I looked around a little and I saw these people that were really happy and said, I'd always loved programming as a kid. So I swallowed my pride, talked to my parents about it, and moved back home and took classes at the local community college. This is, decades and decades ago, and found I really liked it. I liked the market better, and switched back over into doing computing from there. And been happy doing it ever since. I think it's the best job in the world. You get to do great techie stuff. You get to solve problems all day. You get to learn new things all the time and work with interesting people. So it's great. But really, it went all the way back to being a kid.
That's awesome. So when you're not doing technology stuff, do you have any hobbies that aren't tech related?
Yeah. Do you feel like this sometimes, that when you're not doing tech stuff, you're still doing tech stuff?
Sometimes, yeah.
Article to read or thing to do. Besides that, though, my family is important. I'm getting used to having a daughter that's in college now. You've got a couple of years left for that, right?
I got a while, yeah.
Yeah. So tuition, man. But so spending time with the family. Love to go hiking, but I really do spend a lot of time thinking about technology, and I love speaking at user group events. Just did, I think, my 55th talk. So I also try to get out there and talk to people about topics. It's a great way to meet people in the field, and I learn a lot from it too. So
that's awesome. So I know you're going to talk about which web framework you should choose, but if you had to choose right now, just your ideal stack, not just, maybe it's not web, maybe it's just server, but what would your ideal tech stack look like?
Can we come around to that question again at the end? I don't want to mess things up or spoil things too much. It's a great question. I do think that it's a harder question to answer. Well, I'll say that two ways. Harder to say that I'm picking the best one, that it's definitively better than the others. Okay. And I think you have more latitude in picking a good framework that will work well now than we probably ever did in the past. So, all
right. So how about this? Instead of what stack would you use? Let's say the grand scheme of technology out there, if you read a lot about technology, is there any particular technology that you do or don't use that you're really excited about?
It's funny because recently I've been pretty tactical. It's been thinking about web and cloud tech, but I think it is important to always think about what the next thing is. And I talk a little bit in the talk about some of the things that may be coming up that could do a 180 on us in terms of what we do for frameworks or how we do web tech today. But yeah, there's a question, we still think about are cars the next platform? Are voice enabled systems really going to be a bigger part for app developers? Out of all those type of platforms for customers, is there something that I'm not seeing yet that's going to be, substantial, be a replacement for the web-based thing? I don't see it yet, but I think it's important to keep an eye out for it.
All right, awesome. Most people just say blockchain seems pretty cool. You don't need to comment on that. That's fine. Let's see who we have in the chat. So howdy to Joel, a good friend of ours. So Joel, Hal Hayes, Lee. Guten Abend, Solomon, from Deutschland. And Mr. Ned, he's down south from me. He got wrecked by a hurricane, probably. Ned, you should check in with me privately. I want to know how you're doing. So we have a good crowd out there. So hopefully we get some good feedback from the audience while you talk. But I don't want to take up any more time. Steve, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'll chime in when necessary.
Okay, great. I'm going to switch over to the deck. Tell me if you can see that.
I see it.
Great. Well, let's get going then. So what I'm hoping I can do today is talk to you a little bit about what I've learned about making big impactful decisions for a group. Particularly, we're going to look at front-end frameworks, but how to make large decisions about technology at companies. Why is it hard to make these decisions? Are there things we can do to try to make better decisions, and then see them through from a decision to actually being a successful implementation? In terms of front ends, it used to be really easy. We used to be able to say, pick something like jQuery, and that was a great answer. It was a built-in answer for some of our tech stacks. But what we found was we're in a rapidly changing environment. So, for instance, some of the problems that jQuery solved are, for instance, particularly let's talk about the differences between browser releases, and then some cases where JavaScript wasn't up to snuff yet on things like giving you powerful selector APIs. That what's happened is the browsers and the standard organizations have moved those along to the point where those problems are no longer the issues they were in the past. And so what's happened is libraries like jQuery are no longer as important as they used to be for building good apps. We can also see a change in regards to the next major platform, which was AngularJS, or Angular 1.x. For a long time, this was the largest, most popular framework for doing web development. But the team has decided to switch over to stop development of AngularJS, to move to the Angular platform, and to switch the original one to long-term support. So we're in a 3-year window where they're going to continue to do support. But after that, we should be looking at having our apps off on a different platform. So what we find is we have all this variability. Even when we're building apps based on good decisions, the technology that we're building on, the web platform, the browser platforms we're building on can change from, kind of pull themselves out from under us. So what are we supposed to do to make good decisions to be effective inside of a company? We have all these options. And is there a best one or a best way to go that we can recommend? Well, to talk about making decisions, I'm going to start with us as humans and how we fit into this process, how we use our brains to make decisions for a minute. And the first of 2 ways we could talk about would be intuition. And I think I could ask most of you now, just off the top of your head, can you give me an answer to what you'd want to use for a framework or a language for your next project? And you could probably come up with one. That's it's based on your easily retrieved previous experiences. You're able to make these quick intuitive jumps. But what we find is that we are not good at using intuition for making big, untrained assessments like picking a framework. And just as one example, an example, you can come up with an answer in your head. What's the surface area of the Pacific Ocean? And the answer is around 64 million square miles. But I'm just using this as an example of saying when we aren't trained on a topic, when we don't have information to use to estimate things like this, intuition doesn't work well, right? Intuition works great if you're trying to do something like play a game where you have short cycles for feedback. The process is really iterative, so you can test yourself over and over again, and the cost for failure is low. All of those factors are the exact opposite of what we see when we're trying to pick a technology like a web framework. So I'm going to kind of push intuition to the side and say, maybe this isn't the best way to make decisions. The interesting thing, though, is the alternative, which is to take a more studious, academic, research-based approach, doesn't historically give the best results either automatically. You can get great results, but just saying that you've spent a lot of time, let's say plowing through 3 courses on Pluralsight or whatever you're doing, that doesn't automatically turn into valid assessments. And the reason for this is because we as individuals are biased. We have in our biology a set of biases that are going to work against us and make it a little harder for us to do good assessments. Us, our managers, our team, our customers are all going to be impacted by these. And a first step is to really understand a few of them so that you can realize when they're happening on your project. So just a couple off this list. maybe you can think about if you've seen this type of issue happen on your project. Sunk cost fallacy. This is a case where you tend to overvalue previous investments you've made, time or money, on a project. A case where there's a better idea moving forward, but you feel, tied to that previous time and money you've spent on an alternative, even if it's not going to work out as well. Confirmation bias. This is a big problem for research. We tend to favor information that confirms our existing beliefs. So even if I'm looking at material for different frameworks, I'm going to tend to feel better about ones that confirm or reinforce, let's say, the framework that I've already spent time learning. Attribution bias is the case where we tend to think of things, positive things that happen to us, as being because of our character, our effort, and problems that happen to us or people around us as having happened because of bad circumstances. And the opposite for people that we're not associated with. Their problems are probably character flaws, and their successes are probably luck. And last but not least is Dunning-Kruger effect, which is the idea that less competent people are often more comfortable with their level of experience than people who have learned to master a topic. Sometimes when you're new to a topic, you've just started to learn about it, you don't even fully understand what you don't know yet. And all of these biases can result in making questionable decisions. A couple classics from people in our line of work. I think there's a world market for maybe 5 computers, or there's no reason an individual would have a computer in their home, right? So these aren't people that they're not dumb, and they had access to a considerable amount of information about the industry at the time they're at, but they were biased in their case by their previous experience and understanding of the market. And we have to spend a little time thinking, how do we keep from making mistakes like that when we're making decisions too? So the first step is to understand that we all have biases, and being able to communicate about them is important. Oh, by the way, everybody, I just got my presidential alert. So heads up, you might be getting a notification too.
I just got mine too.
Yeah. So
oh my gosh, the world is ending.
Yeah, no. nothing is probably on fire. So, but just a heads up. So the next thing though is you understand your biases. The next thing is you really want to think about how you can bake that type of understanding into a process that you can use to be successful making decisions. This book, Decisive, had a great research point about this. They did a study of different groups and companies that were making these type of large decisions. And they analyzed the process or lack of process they had. Were they simply spending time researching? Did they spend time setting up a process to review things? And what they found was there was a major benefit to organizations that spent time thinking about the process of making good decisions. And some of the examples they had were, do you look into uncertainties about the data you have? Did you look for opposing positions? Did you look for people that have a different perspective than your group? And did you try to rescope the problem? Maybe you don't need a new framework. Maybe you don't need to build for the web anymore. Think outside of that box. And what they found is the organizations that put a process like this in place and were asking these type of questions, which if you notice are the kind of things that are going to help you eliminate bias, they found to be about 6 times more effective in terms of their use of time than groups that were simply doing a large amount of direct research. I don't know how you measure 6 times more effective, but that's what the book said. So a couple rules. 1, establish a process and make sure that it addresses some of the common biases that you could see. A couple benefits, by the way, of doing a process like this, it lets other people in your organization participate. And one of the really crucial features in making a big technology decision is moving other people in the organization into the camp of feeling like it's their decision as well, that they are part of the process of accepting something and that they feel some ownership. A review process lets you do that. The other one is, in a highly political situation, a process is going to age better for you than an email that says that you did some studying and your opinion is to use Angular. You know, that if somebody comes back a year or two later and says, why was this decision made, a process will hold up to that kind of scrutiny better. So, all right, so we talked about biases. We talked about the idea of having a process. Let's talk about some of the options for criteria that you could pick. And these are really mostly things that I have found to be important or to consider in my case. But you're going to have your own list for your own projects, right? And at the beginning, I think the most important criteria to do is to remember that reality applies in doing these projects, that we all fall under the iron triangle when we do projects. And you need to have a realistic look at the resources you have and the time frame you have against the things that you're being asked to accomplish, right? And if you don't keep those in mind, it's easy to fail, right? To decide to do a big project and pick the wrong time to do it. So think about reality, think about the timing of when you do technology adoptions. That said, I'm gonna recommend another video it's about an hour-long video, but if you get a chance, watch Unpacking Technical Decisions by Sarah May. She's somewhat joking, she calls it the May system for technical decisions, where she breaks down large criterias and sub-criteria for picking technology in general. And if it's sort of maybe a 2x2 grid, you could think of it as internal team impressions versus external opinions, and things that relate to the core product versus things that relate to the community. And she breaks those into these 4 categories. But it's a really good starting point to understand about having a broad perspective, asking different kinds of questions. The 3 from this that I find I always go back to is your team comfortable with the way that the product was developed? Are you going to be happy to work with it? And the other 2, which I think are maybe even more important, are does the team that's developing this product you're going to work with show the necessary professionalism for you to trust the future of your product or your team in their work? Are they producing releases on a regular schedule? Is their last release current? Do you find that they're rapidly taking care of bugs and security issues? Do they have a complete set of documentation? Are they keeping up to date with other frameworks and libraries that relate to theirs? You know, when you look at the work, do you believe that they're going to continue to produce a high level of service? Along with that is, and we talk about community later, is that you feel like a product has the necessary level of community support. Nobody wants to go off and pick a tech or framework and find that they have to go on their own on it. You want to be able to go to Stack Overflow and find that somebody's already answered the questions that you have with the product. That if you're going to the common training sites that you might use, that somebody has already developed training material for them. And if you're thinking of upgrading from version 2 to version 3, that's somebody else, that's the type of thing that somebody else has looked at already. So, okay, next. And now I'm going to go down into the weeds a little bit and go through these faster, but these are some of the lower level items that I usually have on a checklist for my things. Have you considered the browser support you need for your framework? Are there certain tools that you really want to use, or languages, for instance, TypeScript or something would be an example? Or, you know, if you have a certain testing framework you feel strongly about, will that work better with one alternative than the other? And by the way, this is a neat site if you go to it. The State of JS is a survey we're going to refer back to a couple of times, and I'll post a link to it later in the notes. Do you have a build process? And this could be something, this is a front end one, it's talking about Webpack and Babel, but do you have a back end framework as well for building and deploying your apps? And will this app fit nicely into it? Have you looked at the list of dependencies? In terms of front ends, right? Front end applications these days are heavy on dependencies, NPM packages. Are you okay with the way that that is being handled? One of the things that people like about React is they've rolled these dependencies up so that you have a single library that manages them for you. You know, does it have that type of technology available so you're not responsible for keeping all of these libraries updated as things change? Are there certain standards like HTML5 standards, ECMAScript, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 future standards TypeScript that you are really looking to use, and does the framework work with them? Is there a certain server-side rendering tech that you're hoping to use, and is there an option for your framework? There's a lot of options these days for mobile, and you know, including progressive web apps. Native script is one that's now cross-platform as well. What are the alternatives you have for mobile? And if mobile's part of the solution you see, are you happy with the options for your framework? Progressive web apps is a major new feature that will help you extend web apps using these types of frameworks to be more powerful, more usable in a mobile setting. Is that type of feature or other new browser features available and easy to use in your framework? What's the modularity of the product look like, and how much do you care? Angular has a reputation for being an all-in-one box sort of a solution. And do you prefer that, or do you prefer something maybe a little more like React and Vue, where you know you're going to be the person who ends up maybe picking a router technology, or picking the HTTP client you use for service calls, or other options like that? Which one of those is a strong point from your perspective? Do you have regulations that you have to meet for your customer or your company? Performance is an interesting question. The general consensus is, if we're looking at the newer frameworks, especially like the Angulars, the Reacts, and the Vues, they're all have the potential to be highly performant applications. But you may find yourself with special needs. You might have, most of your customers are 3G over Wi-Fi, or you could have some special case that applies to you. And if you do, you should think about it as you're picking a framework. So, and then here's the part where we say, you add your own yourself. What is it that's important in your case, or your team, or your organization, and do that. The other one I'm going to say, though, is all of these features are important, but remember to think also about the nature and structure of the team and community that you're working with, because the kind of tactical things that we just talked about, you know, what mobile options are open today, or whether a product works with TypeScript or not, or JSX or something, those things do change over time. So, you know, you credit them in terms of getting the project done, but don't be so bound to them that you think that, you know, you're buying into a long-term arrangement on those small items. Okay, part 3. So we're going to talk about statistics. So there are always limitations to any source of statistics I have found, right? One of them being they are usually referring, of course, to the past. But usually most statistics are tied to some real world aspect of web development. And as a result, there's limitations to how much good you can get out of any one source. But often if you look at them combined together, you can find that they can give you a useful picture of the type of thing that you may choose to use. The other aspect is there's the fashion aspect. I've heard sometimes from folks that really some of the statistics are really about whether something's a trendy product or not about the actual substance of the quality of the engineering of the product. And there is some truth to that. From my perspective, though, I think it's important to find a product that you feel is going to have a community, that there's a large group of people that are interested in it, and if possible. It's more likely to mean that you're going to have additional add-ins, plugins, extensions that you may be interested in. It's going to have better training material. And I think it's also more likely that it's going to be around for a longer time if it has that sort of popularity. So given that and the limitations of statistics, let's run through a few really quick. First one, Google. Google does have a trending site that lets you compare search traffic. And this is a comparison with blue being React, yellow being Angular, and red being Vue. There's a little bit of work that goes into doing this work to try to make sure that you're only tracking the information that's pertinent. For instance, I found it's always hard to separate Angular and AngularJS in results. Vue is also the name, for instance, of a streaming library for PlayStation. So when you're thinking about general stats like this, you know, you have to take those into account. But we can see, for instance, somewhat comparable traffic between Angular and React. we do see an interesting breakup when we look at these for the majority of searches by geography in the United States. You can also use the site to look at geography for the world or for another country. But here in the United States, for instance, it's interesting. You can see more of a trend in, say, New York and the West Coast for React, more search traffic for Angular out here on the East Coast. NPM. NPM is a great source because you are looking at the way that people are downloading libraries, and that's a fairly useful statistic. Do keep in mind that different libraries have a different relationship with downloads, right? If we go back to legacy projects like, say, a jQuery project, people might not even be using NPM for that project. For other projects, it's likely that people are using NPM to do download every time they do a build. So these statistics can be maybe skewed towards modern build chains that pull the libraries more often. Having said that, there's a great article called "The State of JavaScript Frameworks." It's one of several I'm going to refer to in this, that shows the change in JavaScript frameworks over the year of 2017 as a percentage of total downloads. Downloads for NPM went up dramatically, but this is as a percentage. So we can see that Backbone is the only one that had a major drop in that time frame. React by far was the largest, and Angular also sees growth, although it continues to be broken up between AngularJS and Angular requests. The yellow line closer to the bottom, by the way, is Vue. You can also use npm stat if you want to customize those results yourself. It is npmstat.com. You can put in the name of the npm packages in a time frame, and it'll give you a chart back that shows you your statistics. So for instance, for I believe last week in 2018, we can see we were 2.6 million downloads of React compared to 1.5 for Angular and 440,000 for Vue. Stateofjs.com is a great resource. It's a survey done for JavaScript developers annually. I did just recently receive a copy to fill out for this year for 2018. It's not coming directly from a system, but it is the opinion of a large number of JavaScript developers. I won't go through all these statistics, but the idea with this is it's useful as a counterbalance because this is asking developers what they think they will be doing in the future, not just what they've done so far. So for instance, React on the right-hand side has a tremendously high combination. The two dark colors are using it and going to use it. Vue, which is about the middle, stands out for having a tremendously high number of developers who said they are planning to use it in the future. Okay, GitHub. GitHub has a lot of useful information, but I just wanted to particularly call out the Insights tab. And particularly, I'm going to go look at contributors. I'm looking for successful projects to have sort of a healthy flow of commits and contributors to their project. So if I go look at a project like AngularJS, what I see is it's got a great timeline and it has a huge number of people that have been doing commits to the project. I'm even happy to see cases where I see previous contributors who aren't doing things as much and new contributors have stepped in. So you have this flow where this project isn't just based on a limited number of people. It's continued for a long time. That said, we can see in the 2017, 2018 timeframe, the number of commits has dropped off as Angular has come in as a project. Next, I'm going to show you Angular. This one's a shorter time frame, but you can see what you'd expect. A good, healthy number of commits for the project. And that same, you can only see 4 here, but there's a long list of substantial contributors that have been making changes to the project. In my opinion, that bodes well for a project when you can see that type of interest. It's also interesting to see that some of the developers from AngularJS clearly came over to work on Angular. I do want to call this one out. This is the same tab for Vue, and it is interesting in the sense that one is it's got a slightly different chain of commits than some of the other projects, right? It's really trailed off in the last 6 months or so. And that's the version 2 is seeing a limited number of updates. The other thing I find interesting is that Evan Vue is listed as showing almost all of the commits, over 2,000 commits. The second person listed has got 47. So at this point, I'm looking at this project and I'm thinking it's his project. If something was to happen to him, would this project continue on? Are there people that could step up with the knowledge and the time and the interest to have this kind of an impact to keep this project going? And I can't, it may be the case, but I can't tell from this information. And by the way, I'm anticipating a change in this soon because recently I've been posted sort of a list of plans for View 3. And so one of the things we can consider is how does this chart change as View 3 comes out? All right, last, we're going to talk about, well, next to last, Stack Overflow. Stack Overflow also has an API that you can use to track information. This one is saying, what are the what are the percentage of questions being asked about a particular framework? Not shocking, we see less questions being asked about AngularJS and jQuery, and we're seeing a growth in Angular and React questions. Although at this point, we were still seeing more for jQuery than for the others. Maybe because of the fact that there's a huge amount of legacy jQuery already out in the market. Just as a quick one, we'll note also that Vue, this is a smaller scale, right? This is less than 0.5%. Vue does have a big growth curve in this. And at the same time, we can see frameworks like Backbone, Ember, and Knockout seem to be trailing off in terms of interest as questions. You know, maybe that's because all their questions have been answered already, but we're not seeing something comparable from some of the other libraries like Angular. Also interesting from this article, which by the way is called The Brutal Lifecycle of JavaScript Frameworks, this reinforces the idea that we have a geographic change or geographic differences in which frameworks people choose to use. In this case, the farther you are sort of to the left, the more you're using React. The farther you are to the right, the more you're using Angular. And you can see there's a clear geographic distribution of framework use. Also, they showed that there is a breakdown by industry. So if you're in media, tech, or academic, more startup-oriented sort of things, you're more likely to be using React. Where if you're in insurance or finance, for instance, you are more likely to be using Angular. And this goes back to there's a branding question there where the thought is React is going to continue to be the biggest framework in terms of absolute numbers. But one suggestion is that the Angular team is putting themselves out as sort of the enterprise solution for big corporate clients. They're more of an out-of-a-box solution, and that maybe we'll see Angular sitting more at that enterprise space. Last one, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, is Monster. You can open up for your local area one or more of the sites and take a look at the type of job growth you see. Depending on your objectives, this could be important for you or your team. But I will say, I find particularly on job sites that it seems like newer technology seems to lag behind the legacy technology. Maybe it's because people in companies want to take those new React and Vue jobs and want to find somebody to backfill their old AngularJS jQuery position. But you do see differences in these, and this is something that will impact the marketability of people on your team. That could be an important factor. Okay, let's do a quick rundown on some of these frameworks. We've talked a lot about their statistics, but just take a quick look at some of their differences. Starting with Angular. Angular puts itself out as a development platform for building mobile and desktop web applications. Officially, it uses TypeScript, JavaScript, Dart, other languages, but in reality, you're probably going to be using TypeScript when you're building with it. My belief is the switch from AngularJS to Angular was similar to the changes, to the impact that was seen with jQuery. The architecture of browsers and web standards have changed enough that it made more sense to do a clean break than to continue to do incremental changes. Angular is primarily supported by Google. Like all three of the frameworks we're going to talk about here, they've moved away from the MV star type of approach to being component-based architectures. It's using HTML looking templates that look like HTML, although they're actually compiled down to JavaScript for the display of the system, and they do scope your CSS if you'd like to single components. There are some changes to the philosophy of Angular, such as moving away from two-way data binding. They've forked the Ember CLI, and they provide you a ng command line option that makes it easy to do things like add new projects or components to your system. Angular does have the reputation of being the most opinionated of the frameworks. It also has the reputation of being the biggest of the frameworks, although it's not big by comparison to some of the previous generation. It is a very ambitious project, and they came out of the gate saying, we're going to do everything. Mobile, we're going to do testing frameworks, we're going to have everything, right? And they've really worked hard to try to provide a centralized suite of products and utilities across the board. When you're considering tools, consider the fact that your manager probably has heard of Angular. And if you're on an Angular project, and I'm wondering how much this is going to impact things, you might find it easier to say we're upgrading to the new version of Angular than to say we're switching to Vue. Here's a quick sample I'm going to show just to show a little bit of how this structure is set up. This is the general model where you have two main sections, not counting styling, for your component in Angular. You're going to have a template, and then you're going to have the class that actually supports it. You can see in here that this continues to use directives, although a smaller number of them, for things like looping or conditional statements. We are still using double braces for one-way data binding, and that we tend to use braces for changes to properties and parentheses for wrapping events. And this is using this, and there's other things here, like here's a pipeline, and here's a case where two-way data binding is being done. But there's this basic model where you are using a HTML-like template with a limited number of directives and some simple frameworks for doing property and events on them. I found it straightforward and easy to do compared to AngularJS. In the back end, you're going to have a component, which is going to be a TypeScript class that's going to represent the behavior behind that template. We have a set of ES6 style import statements for Angular and for other pieces of functionality in our app. We are decorating our class with a component tag here. This tells us the name of the tag on the site, the name of the template, and an array that can have any styles that we should apply to it. This template here is the one that we just used. And in the class, you're going to see this model of a class that represents the types of data and the types of methods that we want to have available in this particular component. If you think about this basic structure, you're going to find that it's familiar as we look at some of the other options. I'm going to switch over and take a minute to look at React. So React is described by Facebook as a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. They make the distinction of breaking their libraries into a common library and separate ones focused on the web, mobile, and VR interfaces. Where Google was the prime sponsor for Angular, Facebook is the prime sponsor for React. It is another component-based design approach, similar to Angular and Vue. It has the reputation for having a higher developer learning curve, particularly harder than Vue, although what I've found is the time spent on that learning curve has a lot to do with things like functional programming, ES6 functionality in the JavaScript language, understanding concepts like immutability and pure functions. So while those are somewhat advanced topics to learn, once you've spent time on those, that investment can be used on other projects, not simply on React. React is very small in terms of the domain knowledge, in terms of things like directives in other languages that you need to know. So like Angular, you are generally going to use a build process, particularly Webpack and Babel, when you are doing apps in React. You don't have to, but all of the real applications I've seen do. React and Vue, for that matter, use a virtual DOM to track the changes you're making. So instead of directly writing changes to the DOM, you write to the virtual DOM, which is really a JavaScript object, and it decides when those changes should be made to the system. There's a JSX language for templating we'll see in a second. So yeah, this is going to be a lot more writing JavaScript, a lot less doing HTML type of tagging than the other frameworks. While it doesn't have a CLI like in the same way that Angular and Vue does, it does have, Create React App, which you can use to start projects. It's very simplistic in what it does, but it does that part well. Last point for some folks, there have been licensing issues in the past that we've talked about with React, but the general consensus is people are happier with the current licensing model. So if you're using a recent version of React, licensing is less likely to be an issue. Here's our code we're going to look at for React. So one thing I'm going to mention to you is that we don't have a separate template file in this case, right? We are going to immediately go into a class, and this could also be a function, but in our case, a class in JavaScript. That class is going to have methods that we're able to use. It's going to be able to track state as variables as well. And instead of having a template, it's going to have a render function like the one we have here. And you are going to be able to write actual what's called JSX, which is very comparable to HTML in many ways, directly into your JavaScript. This is one of the reasons we need a build process. So it's common to see this type of HTML style code in your React components. Some people don't like this because of the lack of separation of concerns that you have with it. On the other hand, people also like it because it's incredibly flexible. If you want to do something using JavaScript in these systems, it's as easy as putting it in braces, and you're able to add it to this templated flow. View. View is the third one, and while it's not as popular as the other two, it does have a tremendous amount of momentum associated with it. It started off as, by the way, being by far the most simplistic library, but it has a wide set of extensions that you can use to do many things that are comparable to the stuff that we can do in Angular or in React. It is special in the case that it's the only one of these libraries that I would say realistically you might use by including a JavaScript file for Vue and then just coding directly into your HTML page. It's possible to do that type of thing with React, but I'm not seeing people doing it in the real world. You can continue to build modern large-scale components using the Vue CLI or otherwise in the system, much like you do with Angular, but you have this easy option to write a very small page as well. Where the other two frameworks are supported by large corporations, there's Evan Vue is particularly supported in this group by Patreon. So they have a series of smaller supporters that are supporting the organization, doing it financially instead of Google or Facebook. It is the smallest of these frameworks, and there's a question about fast or not, but it clearly is a fast framework. It does have a command line interface similar to Angular. One of the maybe criticisms I could give is there are a lot of options for how you choose to use Vue. More so where Angular on the other end is much more prescriptive. So the benefit is that gives you flexibility. On the hard side, that means maybe it's harder for your team to understand all of the options available to them. You can do component scope CSS like Angular if you use Webpack, Babel, that type of case. It uses a virtual DOM for performance, much like React. And I'm going to just call out really quick the last link there under Vue.js. They do have an interesting comparison guide between these frameworks and some other ones like Ember as well. If you're interested in doing a comparison, it's going to be Vue.js biased. It's from those authors, but they do take a serious look at comparing the frameworks, sometimes at a very low level. So here's a very simple Vue application. But just want to make a point of this, of saying, in this case, we have a script tag. Instead of using any sort of a front-end build process, we're just able to include Vue as a script. Oops, sorry. And then down here, we're able to add a little JavaScript to say, our Vue control should be in the app element on the page. I'm going to have this type of data, these type of methods available to it. And then the Vue app is going to be able to do things like one-way data binding like the message, and has access to directives like the v-on link on the page to let you update data. So in that regard, it's somewhat similar to Angular in terms of the templating format. But the idea is I've had to do very little work to put this onto a page to have functionality that I could even consider doing this type of work if I was using another framework and I just wanted to add this in a few pages on the site. I did want to mention the idea of not using any frameworks at all. GitHub is the recent framework, recent product that most recently did. I'm sorry, GitHub is the product that most recently went with this option. They removed jQuery from the site and they chose to replace it with native HTML5, JavaScript, and DOM. And they've talked about this and they've done articles about this as well. I will say that this is an option, but when you're considering it, this is the way I think of it. JavaScript frameworks, those in combination with the app that you're building on top of them in the back end, they can have a complexity comparable to the complexity of building a car. They've done studies and compared the two of them in the past. So if you find that you can get a car that works well for you, I would suggest that's always going to be a better option than deciding to build one yourself. And there's a similar idea here with frameworks. If you find that the framework is working with you, if it complements the type of things that you need to do, that you're really in a good position to take advantage of that product and that community. But if you do find that the overlap in functionality is fundamentally different, yeah, maybe you should consider your alternatives. A couple TBD items, to be determined. These are things that could throw a monkey wrench in the sort of the current dominance of these three main frameworks in new work. First, web components. Web components are a set of JavaScript, HTML features that make it easy to create, or at least make it possible to create components directly in pages without using a framework like the ones we've talked about. This is a logo for Polymer, a framework that's specifically built to work with web components. My guess is that web components, if they standardize to the level to provide a substantial benefit, are going to be integrated into frameworks instead of being built as separate frameworks. So I don't think this one's going to have a major impact. The traffic for AngularJS is going to be interesting. Where do people go as they move away from AngularJS? My guess, and this is only a guess, is as long as the Angular team provides a persuasive argument for continuing into Angular from AngularJS, I think that is likely to be a common flow, and that we're likely to see more Angular use in the future as a result. If there are problems with that, if other people provide a better path forward, though, we'll see that traffic move in that direction. WebAssembly, I guess Blazor is the example of this, where there are some people looking at using WebAssembly as an alternate framework for doing the same kind of single-page apps as the ones we've talked about. I wouldn't recommend doing it, and I don't recommend Blazor too. We could talk about that later if you'd like. I do think that frameworks will incorporate WebAssembly in the places where it serves the biggest benefit. Those include low-level performance features that aren't the best covered by JavaScript. I do think there's a possibility that progressive web apps will have an impact on the frameworks, particularly in the router space. If we can move away from sort of the single-page app model and the requirements, it's the cheats we sort of do to make that happen. If we can use progressive web apps to give a more real-world example of being able to move across a website, look at different pages, but still get that performance benefit that a single-page app gave, we might see this becoming a direction for routers in the future. The other one is, remember, we're talking about JavaScript frameworks here, right? There's all kinds of new directions that we're seeing for customer interfaces, right? So it's good to spend this time on this, but remember that we're going to continue to see these evolutionary changes to the way that we interact with our systems. And what happens is these frameworks that are optimized for a particular problem set are going to change or be replaced over time. So when you're thinking about these, yeah, it's important to remember there's a timeline, there's a limit to the amount of benefit you get as frameworks optimize for a particular platform. They become less useful for future directions. So, all right, that's enough of where I'm thinking things might go. And those are all just my estimates. So in conclusion, I wanted to say congratulations to you. You've probably picked the best time in history for having to pick a platform. The reality is, I think you're going to find for most people building web apps, if you're choosing a modern supported web framework, you have a strong chance of being successful with that framework as well. If your project's failing, it's probably not going to be because you picked React versus Angular. So it's still worth considering options, but remember, none of these things are going to traditionally cause your project to fail. The things that can cause your project to fail, though, is by not anticipating the necessary steps to integrate a new technology into your company. You really need to think about your tool set, your whole process, and the people that are going to be involved in that decision-making process if you want to be successful. I also remember to go back to that point about Alexa, your job is managing people's expectations about this process, how long it takes to adopt the technology, and how long that technology is going to be useful for. I thought this guy put it well. I think I've had milk that lasts longer than some JavaScript frameworks. This might not be the case. We're getting great mileage out of the current frameworks, but there is a natural life cycle to most technology projects. And I thought Nancy Duarte did a good job of representing this in her last book. Technologies grow, they mature, and they decline. And when you're selling your technology choices to the company, if you can do it, it's important to try to include this concept that you are going to have to continue to mature and evolve your technology choices over time. So be sure to remember your team. Your team is going to make this a success and a failure. And having their consensus and their buy-in is part of leadership, right? Nancy Duarte also had a good point on a TED Talk about this, where she said, remember, you are not the hero of your tech adoption story, right? Your team is. Your job is to not be the Luke Skywalker. Your job is to be the Yoda. And you're here to help facilitate this opportunity of growth for the company and an opportunity in ownership and development for your team as well. So how do you do that? You put a bow on it. You think not only about saying, I've picked technology X, but what is it going to take for your team to be successful? What are the things that you're going to do to bring them into the camp, whatever technology is, into that camp, and advocate for it as well? I mean, some of the examples to consider, have you built sample apps for them to review? Have you made time available for team members to do training or practice or code reviews amongst your team? Are there people who are experts that are available to help with best practices and learning? And have you thought about how this product is going to fit into the overall process of your company that has to do with any sort of a build you have, front end or potentially back end, and the kind of tools like monitoring tools or issue detection tools or any of those type of items you have? Does it fit into those in a way that where your developers can jump on and start writing code and being productive as soon as possible? So that's my talk. Thank you. I'm going to switch back off of the slide deck and jump back on and see if we have questions.
Let's see. Lee had a question. I didn't want to interrupt you because you were in the middle of a thought. That he thought Angular used the virtual DOM as well. My understanding is that's not the case.
Angular did not originally use a virtual DOM, although I had heard the suggestion that that was going to change. I think the consensus is it's a good idea. And the reason for folks is DOM operations tend to be one of the slowest parts of these frameworks. And so if you can centralize those in some kind of a process that makes them run more efficiently, it can make your app more performant. So Lee, how about this? I will take a takeaway. I know Lee too. I will take a takeaway to check on the current status of Angular and see if that's changed.
Yeah. The best analogy I ever heard for virtual DOM is anyone who's done anything with game development is like you have a very expensive operation, which is just rendering stuff to the screen. And they discovered it is faster to render things to a back plane, to a back buffer, and then just flip it into view. So instead of trying to draw everything all of a sudden. So once you start doing all this work in the background, you just present it when it's ready to go. And you do that very quickly. Everything's just much more performant. And virtual DOM works kind of in the same way. Do all the work in the back end, then just display what the result is.
Yeah, absolutely. I saw a great talk by the one of the owners of Ember, who was talking about the typical number of milliseconds you have between refreshes on the screen, and they were trying to optimize Ember to fit into those, you know, say 16 millisecond windows, for very similar to what you're talking about.
Yep. So Lee says uses change detection, happens even earlier than a virtual DOM. Then it's also the reason we have ditched Angular for a lot of our projects, just because the sheer amount of stuff we're putting on the screen, in some cases, it locks the browser up. It just can't do stuff fast enough. But when we switched over to React and Vue, actually not a problem. I mean, you might have a second lag, but it's not locking the browser lag. It's just so much stuff in the screen or in the view. You have a slight lag, but it doesn't lock the browser.
Good.
Solomon asks, go ahead.
Sure. I was going to caveat that too by saying one of the challenges doing this talk I found was I'm realistically not keeping up on all the changes going on all the frameworks. And we're kind of focusing on the top three. Yeah, but it's hard. And it's one of the challenges too when you're picking is you do have to step away from that idea that, you know, the technology you're picking is not going to be the technology probably by the time you put out your first major release even, right? That these things do change at an incredible rate. You know, I could think about, you know, you'd say, oh, I like React because it uses JSX. Well, I can use that in Vue now. Or I like TypeScript, so I'm going to think more about Angular. But people are certainly using TypeScript more seriously for React now. And Vue version 3 is written in TypeScript and supports TypeScript, you know, natively really well. So these things do kind of change out from under us at a really incredible pace.
That's concerning because I really don't like TypeScript.
Well,
because I'm going to go on my tangent here. They say all JavaScript is valid TypeScript, and that is complete BS because I can write perfectly valid JS. You know what? It doesn't work in TypeScript. You have to go through and add all your dang types and definitions and crap like that. Don't like TypeScript. It makes my JavaScript hard to write. ES6 all the way, man.
Sounds like a good follow-up discussion.
Pure ES6. TypeScript's ruining the web.
I'm an ES6 fan, and it has to do with the fact that I personally primarily write React, and I'm doing most of it in ES6. So
yeah, the same way. We're the same way. Yeah, every time I have to pull TypeScript in, it's like it's what should take 5 seconds to write literally takes like 10 minutes because of a little BS. So
I think I've heard some people saying the bigger the team is that's doing a project, the more you're likely to be happy you have TypeScript too.
Okay. That's maybe newer versions will change my mind. All right. Any more questions out there? Solomon had a question. Should the version and release cycles be weighted as well? So how often are they updated? Do you take that into account?
That's an interesting point. And I did think about that when I was reviewing. Is, for instance, the fact that Vue is considerably slower. Could that work as an advantage to a lot of companies where maybe you're not interested in having a new major release a breaking release coming out every 6 months?
Or more often than that, yeah.
Yeah, so that would certainly be something you could consider. Yeah, I mean, I just kind of touched the surface of things to consider when you're thinking about your particular project and the culture of your organization. And where you're starting from, too. What do you have to start with? Where are you moving from where to where? That's a big question for a lot of people is how hard is it going to be to move from what I have to the next thing?
We have we have projects that are written in every single technology you talked about. So we have an Angular 1 app that we support. We have an Angular latest 4. I think the latest we've taken it to is Angular 4. I don't remember if we bumped it up to 5. But we also have a React app that we support, and then we have a Vue app that we support. And I think from the team perspective, they prefer Vue immensely over everything. React being the close second. I really like React. But React can be a little daunting when you start to get into state management of your entire application. I mean, it's just a different mindset. But it's easier to grasp than anything we ever did in Angular. Just from I need to get something working. I don't want to spend an entire week on plumbing and ceremony just to put some data on the screen from a web service call. I'm a
Redux fan, but I think we can see in the market too that the rest of the market was Redux fans too, and we've had these other frameworks have gotten their own versions. Well, you could use Redux anyway. It wasn't React specific, but that we've seen the other libraries have come out with their own Redux versions too. Yeah, it's a good pattern.
Alrighty. Well, unless anyone has any other questions, we'll just go ahead and wrap it up there. Steve, again, thank you so much for hanging out with us today. We greatly appreciate it. We had some good chatter in the chat. That doesn't usually happen. So thank you, chat, for being active.
Thank you.
And this will go live on YouTube probably in a day or so. So I put the link in the chat. Go subscribe to our YouTube page if you're not already. We'll just continuously keep putting stuff up there once we build it. But we'll see you all again in a couple weeks for the next episode of the SwiftKick Show. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.